But it's nice to have a bit of stopping, isn't it? A bit of stillness. Have a seat. We have our Kids Life program that is starting upstairs. So if you would like to head up to that and you're a child, then you're welcome to do that. If you'd like to get up and you're an adult, you're also welcome to do that. You just need to become a leader of that group, and they would be very happy to have you helping out up there. So talk to Claudia if that's you. Well, we are in this Foundations series, and today, jumping all over the place. Today we are thinking about the basics on Christ is our topic. I don't know if you know this game, Top Trumps. Anybody know Top Trumps? Yeah, Sam does. Sam, he's the young'un here. Even parents of kids with Top Trumps know what Top Trumps were. So Top Trumps is this card game, and what happens in Top Trumps, there's all these different versions of it, but you get a couple of cards in you deal them out around the group, and on the cards are these attributes, and they're about this character. So this is a Star Wars version of Top Trumps, and there's Luke Skywalker there, and Rey and Mace Windu. And then you got ranked in terms of style, ambition, tenacity, pride, leadership, and Top Trumps Galactic Legend ranking. And they've all got their rating. And so when it's your turn, say I'm Luke Skywalker, and I've got Luke Skywalker in my hand, I look at Luke and go, his leadership looks pretty good at 70. And so I'm gonna play Luke, and I'm gonna say Luke Skywalker's leadership. And I'm like pretty confident here that I'm gonna beat everybody and be the top trump. But next person plays Rey, and they've got a leadership of 90, and they're now beaten me. But then Mace Windu gets played and have a leadership of 130. And so whoever played Mace Windu gets all those cards, and whoever has the most cards at the end, you should end up with all the cards with yourself, and then you win Top Trumps. Make sense? So now you know how to play. Oh, come on, John, I didn't get it yet. Well, you'll have to ask your grandkids. Your grandkids know how to play Top Trumps. So next time, play Top Trumps with them. Here's my question that I'm wondering though. What would go on Jesus' Top Trump card? If we want to boil it down to the basics of who Jesus is and what characteristics he has, it's important for us to understand. How do we bring that down to describe Jesus in a Top Trumps card? I don't know if you've thought about this, or the reality is that the way that Jesus is described and the way that makes sense to you who he is dependent on your cultural context. If you look at the Bible, you'll see that the way that Jesus is described is just dependent on the cultural context of who he's being described to. So at the moment in this series, we're in the book of Hebrews. The book of Hebrews is written to the Hebrews, which is another name for the Jewish people. And so the way that he is often described, this is the way that they most would have, I think, articulated who Jesus is in a way that people would understand. They would say, this is the way you understand Jesus. This probably would have been on the Top Trumps card in those days for how you understand who Jesus is. Do you know who that is, or what that's a picture of? Probably not. Well, maybe you might have an idea, but it doesn't make sense in our context. This is the high priest. This is a depiction actually of one of the great high priests called Melchizedek. And this is how they would have understood. Oh, Jesus is like a great high priest. And they would have gone, okay, that makes sense. He's a mediator between God and man, and this is who Jesus is. And so it's interesting to me as we come to the book of Hebrews and they're talking about the high priest and we're going, okay, that's an interesting way to describe him. Actually, for the Jews, I think this is the main way they would have described Jesus. This is the way that everyone would have gone, now I understand who Jesus is. He's the most important person in our culture. He's the most important person in our community. He's the one with the highest honor amongst us. That is who the high priest is in the Jewish community. For us, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And so what happened was that when Paul came along, the Apostle Paul, he was a Jew himself, he understood this picture of describing Jesus. But he said he's going to the Gentiles because he thought the message of Jesus was for everybody. And so when he goes to the Gentiles, he doesn't use high priest as his main way of describing Jesus, if you think about it, through the New Testament. Instead, he uses another image. This is an image that he uses. It's not that exact picture, but it's a picture of who that is. Anyone know who it is? That's a Caesar. That is a depiction of Nero, who was the Caesar, the emperor, in the time when Paul was going around and trying to describe to people who Jesus is. And it's really interesting because in the Roman world, the thing that you would say about Caesar is that everybody would go around saying Caesar is Lord. Not only that, but the Caesar himself, the understanding of the Caesar from very early on with the Caesars, I think it was actually from the first Caesar with Augustus, that they understood that when the Caesar died, that Caesar became a god. This is what they believed. He was the ruler on earth, and when he died, he became a god. Actually, what happened over time as the Caesars went on, the Caesars themselves said, hey, it's not when we die when we become a god. We're a god now. We're a god leading you on earth. We are sons of God. And so the Caesars would call themselves gods while they led. And everyone else will say, Caesar is Lord. And Paul comes around and says, you want to understand who Jesus is? Jesus is God's son. Jesus is Lord. And people would be taken aback and go, how can he say Jesus is Lord? Caesar is Lord. And Paul says, good, you're listening. Let me explain to you. Interesting, the cultural context determines how you explain who Jesus is, what's on the top trump card. And so the question is for you and for me, I'm thinking, well, what is it for us in our day? How do we describe, how do we depict in a way that people understand the basics on Christ? How do we help people to know who he is? What is on his top trump card? Because we would say that Jesus for us is the top trump. Maybe for little kids playing top trumps, we're going to say, Jesus is top trump. And they'll go, oh, okay, yeah. How do we describe how he is? He's the card that beats all others. If you play the Jesus card, you know it's always going to win. You're always going to win the game. Maybe in our context, thinking of our world today and the most powerful people in the world. Here is a text that is written in the book of Hebrews that describes the basics of who Jesus is, written to the Jewish people using this high priest image. High priest being the one that has access to God on behalf of the people, most prestigious title in the Jewish community. Here is what the writer in the Hebrews says. Jesus prayed while he lived on earth. That is, he performed the role of a priest. That's a priestly role. He made his appeal with sincere cries and tears. He prayed to the God who could save him from death. God answered Jesus because he truly honored God. And then this description of who Jesus is. Jesus was God's son. But by suffering, he learned what it means to obey. In this way, he was made perfect. Eternal salvation comes from him. He saves all those who obey him. God appointed him to be the high priest, just like Melchizedek. Melchizedek is this mysterious Old Testament priestly figure. He is actually a king. He's the first priest named in the Bible. So before the Jewish priestly system, Melchizedek is the first priest named in the Bible. He's also the king of a place called Salem, we're told. Salem is probably the city that precursed Jerusalem. So he comes from this place. He's a Canaanite city. And his name, Melchizedek, means my king is righteousness. We're told he's the priest of El Elyon, the Most High God. And he only appears in this one story when he goes and blesses Abraham. But the Jewish people understand this very well. We'll come back to this soon. But let me just keep on with a train of thought of the writer to the Hebrews here. God appointed him to be the high priest, just like Melchizedek. And this is what he goes on and says. He says, we have a lot. That's because you are no longer trying to understand. By this time, he's saying to the people, you should be teachers. You should be showing other people how to live. You should be showing other people in their context how to survive the persecution that they're under. But in fact, you need someone to teach you all over again. You need even the simple truths of God's word. You need milk, not solid food. Anyone who lives on milk is still a baby. That person, solid food is for those who are grown up. They have trained themselves to tell the difference between good and evil. That shows they have grown up. The writer here is saying to the people there, you're capable of understanding more. You should be understanding more. You should be understanding the meatier teaching that I'm giving you. Active media teaching. He's already given media teaching in the book already. So he's saying you're capable of understanding this. You should be consuming something that's heavier. You should be showing people in the face of persecution, but it seems like you're shrinking back. And what you're doing is you're shrinking back to what you want, just as the comforting basics. He's not saying that they require milk. He's saying they require solid food. And so he's very direct with them through these passages. If you read the passages around, I'd encourage you to. They'll challenge you, and I'm happy to answer questions. Actually, the talk that I wrote today goes into all the chunky stuff around it, but I thought, let me just give you more of the basics today as we go in this. And if you've got questions about that chunky stuff, then I'm really happy to chat more about it. And so the writer says to them, okay, so let's go. What you need to do is move on from the basics. Move beyond the simple teachings about Christ. Let us grow up as believers. Let's not start all over with a basic teaching. And what he's doing is referring back to what he's just talked about. He's saying, I've just told you what the basic stuff is. Now let's move beyond this. But what I want to that basic stuff, so we have a foundation. We understand what he's saying and what he's describing, for us to think about that in our own context. He's not saying leave them behind. He's saying these are foundational things. Don't abandon them, but don't stop with them either in your growth into maturity. And he says that here are what the basic teachings are, and this is what they taught us. They lead a person on a process. The Christian journey is a walk you go through, and this is the process that he's describing. They taught us first, we need to turn away from doing things that lead to death. It's often a word that is used in the New Testament, repentance. It's a change of mind, and it's a change of approach based on that change of mind, based on the information that we have. It's like, I got that wrong. I need to rethink this. I need to take a different approach. That's repentance. And then he says we must have faith in God. Faith being this new belief that we've started to have, that trust this. I believe this. This makes sense to me in some way. What I'm being told about who Jesus is based on what I used to trust. There's a change that's happening here. He says that we need to learn about different ways of becoming clean, going through this process of coming to a place where you want to be baptized, where you want to publicly express to other people, this is where I am now. I'm different. I've got a different approach to life. I've changed my thinking. That's what baptism is about. We're talking about all these things in the next few weeks. And then the placing hands of blessing on people. The idea is that once you have been baptized, you are a follower of Jesus. You've said, I'm a follower of Jesus. And what Jesus does is he gives you his spirit, which sends you out into the world to live for him. It's this, you become a missionary. You become an apostle, that is one who is sent. And so it's this idea that once you're baptized, then you are sent out into the world with God's blessing. 5, that people will rise from the dead. That this is the hope. That no, regardless of what you face in this life, regardless of what happens to you, regardless of the death that you experience, which is inevitable, that you will one day rise again in a new creation. And that God in that new creation will judge everybody. That he is the one that rules over all, and what he decides lasts forever. God brings justice in that place. He's a good judge who judges rightly. This is the foundations, Paul is saying. This is a very significant process. This is a very important process that everyone who follows Jesus begins walking through at all different times and in all different ways and at a different pace for every person. And your own experiences and your own context determines how long that takes and how that works. There's no kind of one set way that this happens. Well, my question for you is, whereabouts are you on this process? Where are you as you think about yourself? Maybe you're before that first step and you're living in a way that you think is right. It's not as if you're living against what you think is right, but actually your experience of that is it's leading you to death and not to life. It's not actually leading you to freedom. And the invitation is that as you look to who Jesus is and what he has done and the different life that he offers, then there's something that can click. There's an eye-opening, there's an enlightenment, a revelation that, maybe there's a different way. And then it's not like when you start to believe these things, it's a blind, I don't believe it, but I'll do it anyway. That's not faith. Faith is, my ideas about this have changed. My belief system has changed. I see the world differently. And faith is that act of trusting based on this new information that you have. Different ways of becoming clean. Maybe you're at a point where you're going, you know what? This change has happened in me, but I haven't told everyone, and I'm kind of scared to. It's a frightening thing to do. What am I committing myself to here? Making it public. But maybe you're like, I know I want to do that. I want to tell people that this is who I am now. And it's time for you to say, yeah, I'd like to do that publicly. Maybe for you've been through this process and you're kind of like, yeah, I'm a Christian. I've been baptized. But you don't see yourself as someone who is on mission for God. You see people like me as that. You're the one that's a pastor. You're the one that does the mission stuff. But Jesus says, no, it's all of us. And there's a change happening in you to go, hey, what does it mean for me to be on mission? What does it mean to be commissioned with him? What does it mean to be empowered by his spirit in my daily living, in the way that I walk? And maybe you are on this process and you're facing difficulty and suffering, and you're kind of awaiting this inevitable demise of your body and your mind, and it's scary. And you need to remember there's a real hope in that Jesus gives. That beyond this world, he is making all things new. And one day you will rise and he will be a good judge of everything that happens in this world. And he will bring that about, justice, so that the new creation is far, far better than what we experience and see here. This is the framework for the Christian story from here into the age to come. And it's what we're going to explore more in the next few weeks. And so as you think about where you are in this process, I've been thinking this week about the fact that all of our stories are just so different. And our own context and our own experiences determines how easily or not easily we understand who Jesus is on his top trump card that's given to us. What it means for him to be the great high priest. If that's all you ever got, would you ever understand it? Or that you've been probably told that Jesus is Lord. What does that mean to you? Does that make sense to you? How does it make sense in your heart language? For me, I know I had to come from a place where I was brought up a Christian and was like, yeah, I'm a Christian. And I got to a place where I was like, well, I was 18 or so, grown up in a Christian family, believed all these things, and I had to make a decision. Is this something that I've just been passed on to me? Or is this something that is true for me? And I had to ask God a hard question. And I said, if you are real, I need to show you me in a way that I understand. Maybe that's a question you need to ask. And he did, in a way that I understand, not even in a way that I can explain to you, but a way that over the next few years, my eyes were opened. It made more sense to me. I explored things that maybe other people would have been scared to explore. I studied ancient history at uni, and I was like, I'm not going to Bible college to study ancient history because I reckon they've got bias. I'm going to go to a secular college and study ancient history and see if this stuff is real. And that's just what I need to do. And I read books and other religions and their approach. And where I landed was to go, the more I look at who Jesus is, the more it makes sense to me. More it helps me to see the world. I think of people in our own community here that have had very different experiences to me. I've been reflecting this past week on someone who became a very dear friend of mine here, and many of us here too, a lady named Alma. Last week would have been Alma's 50th birthday. And you might know Tao. He's not here this morning. He's over in New Zealand for work. But I've asked him if it's okay to share a little bit about my experience of Alma. She walked into our 11:30 service up there one day, the beginning of the year. You remember Michael and Gloria? She walked in that first Sunday of the year, and she was like, something's different here. This feels different. What is this? And during the music, she just started crying. And she's like, I don't know what's happening, but I need to explore this. She did the Alpha course with us. She, through that, came to understand who Jesus was, and she had her eyes open. She changed. Alma, though, was struggling with cancer. She'd been diagnosed with cancer and it had to end up going right through her body. She said, before I die, I want to be baptized. And so she was baptized here. Claire and I baptized her here. It's a beautiful experience of seeing this person who had come not knowing anything about Jesus really, but finding in him a hope that she otherwise did not have as she faced the death as this cancer riddled through her body. And I remember going and visiting her when she was in palliative care, and they'd have this happy hour where drinks came around and bring it around to people, and just chatting to her and seeing her peace and seeing her hope and seeing her faith and seeing the way that her faith sustained her through such difficulty. She understood something of who Jesus is and the difference that he made. You have your own story. You know your own stories of other people here. I think of a man named Jürgen Moltmann. He is a German theologian. He died last year, actually. He was born in Germany in 1926. And as a teenager, he was conscripted to the German armed forces. He was captured as a prisoner of war by the British and spent the next years of the war in prisoner of war camps in England and in Scotland. And to think about him, to many of us in our minds, we think of him as an enemy. How could he become a German soldier? But this is where he was. This is his context. This is what he was born into. This is where he ended up. Did he have a choice in that? Had he thought through those things clearly? Not as a teenager. And I'm going to quote from an essay he writes pretty extensively here, just to give you a bit of a picture of the wrestle that he has as he comes to terms with this. He says, I belong to the generation which consciously lived through the horrors of the Second World War, the collapse of an empire and all its institutions, the guilt and shame of one's own nation, and a long period as a prisoner of war. Those of us who survived those years and who came back from the camps and hospitals were certainly burnt children who from then on shunned the fire. We had learnt justifiable mistrust. We were weighed down by the somber burden of a guilt which could never be paid off. And what we felt about life was an inconsolable grief. understandably, from what he experienced. He talks about the time when he was in the prisoner of war camp. He says, what I felt all at once was all the mainstays that had sustained my life up to then. It was only slowly that something different began to build up in their stead. At home, back in Germany where he grew up, Christianity was only a matter of form. One came across it once a year at Christmas time as something rather remote. In the prison camps where I was, I only met it in very human form. It was nothing very overwhelming. And yet, the experience of misery and forsakenness and daily humiliation gradually built up into an experience of God. It was the experience of God's presence in the dark night of the soul. God as the power. I cannot say I found God there, but I do know in my heart that it is there that he found me and that I otherwise would have been lost. Jürgen Moltmann, in a very different context, in a very different place, discovers God in the compassion that he feels God has for him in his place of misery and difficulty. And God found him in that place. He had an experience of him. He had a presence of God in the dark night of his soul. And it's this little quote of Jürgen that led me to share this, because I think what he says in terms of describing how he lives and how he understands why he is a Christian as he grows up and becomes the German theologian, very world-renowned theologian. He says this: in him, I found the power of a hope. And there's three things he says here. It's a hope I can believe, a hope I can live, and a hope I can die with. Excuse the typo there. In him I found. He says, it's a hope that I can believe. Who Jesus is became believable to Jürgen Moltmann. It's not something that he just accepted. He looked at him and he believed. Jesus is who he claims to be. But not just something he believes, but something that then shapes his life in the way that maybe he would say that he would prefer to live this way following Jesus. He sees the good that comes from following Jesus in this life. It shapes the way he lives. It gives him hope in living. And not only something while he lives, but something that provides him a hope as he faces the inevitability of death. A hope beyond this world that says that God is good and powerful and he's making all things new. A hope beyond the here and now. This passage that we've looked at today articulates the basics that I think Jürgen would say he finds in that hope. Here's that passage again. This is what the writer of the Hebrews says. Jesus was God's son. Jesus comes to earth as the image of God for us to see, to make sense of, to recognize. By suffering means to obey. He suffered in this world and us do. He fully understands what it means to be human. Yet he was able to fully trust God in that process of maturing as human. In this way, he was made perfect. Jesus became the one who could offer himself, this is high priestly idea, offer himself as the perfect sacrifice on behalf of the people. In the Jewish system, the sacrifice that you're offering to atone for the people's sin is that blameless lamb, and this high priest is able to offer himself because he's the one that properly trusts God, the blameless himself. And by that, eternal salvation comes from him. By making himself that sacrifice, giving up his life, like the priestly sacrifice in the Jewish temple system. He saves all those who obey him. Everybody who turns to him in trust can live with this hope. And God appointed him to be the high priest like Melchizedek. In this way, he becomes that mediator between God and humans, morally blameless, eternally available to all people who turn to him. The name Melchizedek, as I said, is this name that means my king is righteousness. My king is justice. My king is the one that lives the blameless life, that enacts justice in this world as its rightful ruler. He was a priest of El Elyon. He is priest of the Most High God. And he only appears in this one story in the Bible, though he's named at other places as well. He appears in this story in the Bible where Abraham is coming back from rescuing his cousin. And he comes and meets Abraham on the road. Abraham being the founder of the Jewish people, the one through whom God says that he will bless the whole world. And Melchizedek comes as this archetype of the Christ. He comes as the forerunner to the Messiah, the picture that we can have in our mind through the Old Testament of who this kingly figure, kingly priestly figure is. And what Melchizedek does is he comes to Abraham, is he brings him bread and he brings him wine. He brings him the food to sustain him. And so as we think of our King and Jesus in this image, we remember him bringing the bread and the wine as symbols for us to remember him by. The basis of our faith is in this picture. The basis of our faith is in this act. I think that's why Jesus gives it to us, because everything we need to understand about who Jesus is seen in this expression, where we are the people that he invites to the table, and he says, everybody who would come to the table can come and share. If you want to follow me, you're welcome. And when you walk into this room, there's no hierarchy in here. There's no more important people. In this room, it's not based on how much you earn or how good a job you have or what you've done with your life or how well you've made decisions or what your children do or where you live. It's not based on any of that. There's no hierarchy. Everybody in this room is on a level playing field. Everybody is welcome onto the table. That's what Jesus says. We're all brought to him, to come under him as the king. And on the night before he died, he took the bread and he gave it to his disciples and he broke it, saying, "This is my body given for you." And soon we will take some of this bread and you will hold it and feel it in your hand, the physical expression of Jesus' body given to you, so easily broken, so willingly broken. He says, "Eat it in remembrance of me." And then after the meal, he took the cup. And they had wine in those days. We got grape juice. And he said, "This cup is a new covenant in my blood. This is the promise that I'm for you, I'm with you, that you're not alone, that in this world you'll have trouble, but take heart. I've overcome the world." And so as we come and share in this meal, we're sharing in the basis of our faith. We're turning to this Jesus who we understand as the one who is the top trump, the one who rightly rules over all. The way he does that is by laying down his life. So counterintuitive. The way we see that he's the greatest is because he can lay himself down. So I'm going to invite you to come forward, and we've got the old school way of doing it with a piece of bread and some grape juice because we ran out of the other ones. And I've had the kids help me fill up the cups. So if you'll have to choose one that's not too full, unless you want a challenge. why don't you come forward and collect these, and the band will just play a little bit as we do that, and then bring it back to your seat, and we're going to take it all together.